Good morning. The $1.2 trillion U.S. construction industry is the largest and, as we all know, most competitive market in the global economy. Yet the productivity of the construction process, the methods, the quality, the pace, the cost in which infrastructure is built is lagging. One obvious solution for improved productivity is the use of modular construction. Harvey Bernstein is Vice President, Global Thought Leadership and Business Development at McGraw-Hill Construction. He is here with us today to share some results of a very comprehensive research study that gives us some perspective on where prefabrication and modularization might be headed and the issues that impact the growth of our industry and the trends that might change the way we build. So please join me in welcoming Harvey Bernstein. Good morning.
Outside of thanking the Modular Building Institute for being one of our premier sponsors of the study. This study, by the way, involved 14 different industry associations where we went out across the industry gathering data. And the end result of that was we ended up with 800 respondents on the survey data. And it broke down to about 430 that were contractors using it, and then 171 engineers and about 77 architects. We had some non-users, or about 125 non-users, and then the other 684 that were users. And so you'll see the difference in that time frame. I'll start, though. I'm going to break down my presentation in telling you a little about the background of the study, and then talk about building type preferences and give you a little industry outlook. As you may or may not know, McGraw-Hill Construction, we track all construction in the U.S. And in doing that, we track about 500,000 active projects every year. In that, we digitize the plans and specs for about 60,000 of those, as well as collecting the building permits on that. And then that data is used going forward as well as back in terms of forecasting the size of the industry and the trends of the industry, which becomes really important as we forecast. And so I'm going to give you a little perspective on the industry forecast. I'll talk a little about the respondents to the survey, a little on their profile and levels of use, and then also about non-user opinions. And then I'm going to give you some player insights and wrap up with some of the study highlights that indicate how prefabrication and modularization are really impacting productivity and the bottom line business benefits that are coming out of that, and then some key takeaways and recommendations. So in looking at this study, and actually Gail referred to both of the key elements, what's interesting is when we decided to do this study, it was built around the fact that last year we had just finished another major study called Green BIM. We've done a number on BIM, done a number on green. We combined them. One of the key things that came out of our conference was the number one trend that was identified from the Green BIM study was, in fact, prefabrication and modularization as being the next major and most important trend developing to impact the industry. So you're right in the right place based on that. One of the trends that we identified in our BIM Green study, our Green BIM study, was the shift of more and more companies that are involved in green looking at the use of BIM in terms of its impact on prefabrication. BIM model-driven prefabrication is a major trend really moving in that direction. We also found in the study that the number one growth between A&E firms was saving time and money using BIM for model-driven prefabrication, and with contractors at 75%. So those trends really showed us that green and BIM have a direct impact on industry productivity and business benefits. Now, as I move into building type preferences, and I know Gail was talking about military housing in that, the top two that were on the list across the board in our survey as the predominant markets for prefabrication modularization were healthcare facilities and college buildings and dormitories. College building and dormitories, of course, a lot of similarity to what's going on in military base housing right now. Behind that was manufactured buildings, and then offices and public buildings. Over 1/3 of the respondents already indicated that they're using prefabrication and modularization. Now, you got to keep in mind in a study like this, use of prefabrication and modularization basically means that they're doing at least one building in their portfolio. In a little while, I'll tell you how quickly the trends have changed in terms of percentage of buildings that they're doing in this area. We also went and did an individual ranking. If we asked them, okay, what building type for you was the one area that you believed had the greatest impact going forward to really focus on prefabrication modularization, healthcare was once again on the top of the list, followed by commercial warehouses and hotels and motels. Now, one of the things that we found in our data, besides looking at the total industry, we broke it out amongst architects, engineers, and contractors. And the reason for doing that is we wanted to get a handle on what role the different players in the industry actually have on the impact of the movement of this trend across the industry. And for instance, in the architects, the top 3 opportunities that architects are most focused on for prefab and modularization were multifamily housing, schools K through 12, and hotels and motels. Contractors, healthcare facilities were at the top of their list, followed by hotels and motels as well, and then office high-rise. And then lastly, engineers, their top 2 were commercial warehouse and manufactured buildings. And then about 17% of the engineers came in and identified a sort of a range that we called other that included data centers, industrial facilities, and churches. So you're beginning to see a widespread implementation of prefab modularization across the board. Now, what I wanted to do was put in perspective, when you begin to think about the opportunities for you and looking at this market, you do need to understand the growth and size of the market. Just to put in perspective, total construction in 2007 from our forecasting models was $641 billion. In 2010, after the downturn in the economy, it was down at $416 billion for total construction. We're estimating that this year, 2011, it'll go to 438 and hit 540 by 2012. When we look at commercial buildings, you can really see the impact the down economy had. In 2007, it was $100 billion. In 2010, it was $40 billion. Quite a drop in that area. We're now projecting going up to 45 this year and 60 billion next year. And one other area, just to indicate the perspective on the drop-off in the marketplace, and that's single-family housing, 200 billion in 2007, and 99 billion in 2010, with slowly coming back up now. I break out office buildings showing the trend over the last years from 1986 all the way to 2012 to see the growth. I also identify for your benefit what's going on in the green marketplace. So for example, in 2008, the green office sector was at $27 billion, office buildings. In 2010, it dropped to $15 billion, about half of that. But yet the green part of office construction, new green office construction, held at $8 billion, which meant that it went from 30% of the market to 50% of the market. So even in a down economy, office buildings, new construction in green really held its own. When I move over to institutional buildings like education, education in 2008 was $58 billion. It dropped to $44 billion in 2010. But during this downtime of the marketplace, green construction, new green construction in education grew from $9 billion to $16 billion. When I look at healthcare, that's where you really see the growth. Overall market for healthcare construction dropped from $30 billion to $22 billion in 2010. But healthcare new construction grew from $4 billion to $9 billion, 40% of the market, rapid growth. And in fact, right now, in large construction where the predominant aspect of green construction takes place, healthcare hospitals are representing over 80% are green being built right now in this marketplace. So let me shift into prefabrication and modularization use. We took a look at what the most frequently used building elements were by the largest percentage of respondents. So nearly 50% of all respondents identified exterior walls, MEP building systems, and building superstructure as the top elements, building elements that they're using in prefabrication. Architects actually exceeded this 50%. On exterior walls, they were at 68%. Contractors were at 62% versus the 50% on the MEP building systems, and engineers at 71% over the 50% for building superstructure. One of the things that we found from the study with regard to construction, prefab, job condition, what's driving that? And we found job conditions were an important driver for prefabrication and modularization. So the one thing that showed up way on top was job site accessibility. So one of the interesting things is you can't generalize that if a company is using prefab and modularization, they're going to be using it on all their projects, because construction site accessibility had a big impact as to whether they would use it on certain projects or not. We found, for instance, from owners, part of the study, which is still ongoing, we're doing in-depth interviews of owners, and we found the owners to say that doing prefabrication, modularization type construction, they were finding significant reductions in scaffolding and improvements in site safety as a result of assembling these off-site. Job site accessibility, though, was a key element. The next thing that had a lot of variability with regard to job condition drivers was building height. We saw preferences on 1 to 4 stories. Then we actually saw preferences on 5 and above. So there's a real wide-scale blend on building stories with regard to what that best use is. We were finding examples covering a wide range of building heights. Then type of building exterior was another area that depended on when an architect, an engineer, or contractor would be looking at prefabrication or modularization with regard to building exteriors. And then in particular on the modularization area, the layout of the building interior was the biggest influence for architects at around 52% compared to contractors at 27%. We also found that between 2009, when the study was based on what were you doing in 2009, to what will you be doing in 2013, looking back 2 years, looking forward 2 years, that contractors were using prefabrication and modularization on some of their projects. Around 84% of those were, and had varied around that same level. But we found by 2013 that almost the entire industry, including the non-users, expected to be at somewhere around 99% of use of prefabrication and modularization on some of their projects. So just within a 2-year period, looking forward for you, you're looking at pretty much every major player in the industry will be using prefabrication and modularization on some of their projects. So the logical question comes out of that, well, some of their projects, how many does that represent? And so in 2009, we found that 37% of those we surveyed used prefab and modular building processes on more than 50% of their commercial buildings. That was in 2009, 37% of them. In 2013, 45% estimate that they will be using prefab modularization on at least 50% of their buildings. When we took a look, just for your information, on those that were not using prefabrication and modularization right now across the industry, we found that 87.2% of the non-users today have no projects in which they were using it, expect to be using it by 2013. And at least on 1 to 25% of their projects, with contractors saying about 23% of their projects, between 26 to 100% by 2013. So contractors were right out in front there in terms of companies that today were not using any. Now, what's the reason that right now contractors, architects, and engineers are not using prefab or modularization? The number one reason at 50% was architects didn't design prefab into the project. And I think Gail mentioned a little while ago the importance of getting architects to be able to include and do that. Second reason was the types of projects that they do are not applicable to prefabrication. So there's an education aspect required there. Third was they're not familiar with the process of prefab or manufacturers. So once again, an educational requirement. And then the fourth top one was owners don't want prefabricated modular elements. So education. One of the things that's really clear in a lot of what we were determining was that education is a really key factor in getting people more familiar with what can be accomplished. We also found that non-users, the drivers for them to use it in the future, boiled down to saving money. All respondents felt that saving time and money was an important driver. Behind that was schedule, saving time. And then behind that was the owner demand. There was also the comment that there's a real competitive advantage that they feel in the future is going to give them an edge if they were to use it. So I mentioned we're doing a bunch of in-depth interviews of owners to see where the owners line up on this. And not all of that is finished, but I put down some anecdotal information from that just to show you. From an owner's perspective, they feel that one of the key reasons for using prefab modularization applications is that it will help fill skilled labor gaps. And of course, in a down economy, labor is a little more accessible. But one of the things we've observed in some of our trends during this down economy was the very fact that there are people that are leaving the industry in order to find jobs to earn salaries and may or may not return back to the industry. Owners also felt there was less disruption of the existing business operations. One of the things that owners commented on was that there was significant competitive advantage from project cost savings as small as 2 to 5%. And I'll touch on what we were finding from those that we surveyed when I come to the major conclusions here. Also that owners felt cost and schedule were the biggest drivers, bigger than the return on investment. Saving on both cost and schedule were big factors. Another element that the owners recognized was the higher quality of the building components that they're getting, being done in that controlled environment without the impact of weather and that, and being able to do it in a time frame to meet a delivery need. And then just-in-time delivery of prefabrication components was another key element with regard to owners. Now, from the user's perspective, currently as to why they're using prefabrication and modularization elements, number one on the list was improving productivity. And that was a case with architects, engineers, and contractors. They all agreed that this whole area results in higher productivity improvement, so that was really important. Second, they felt that it gives them a competitive advantage in the marketplace. And third, they felt that it generated greater return on investment. The users' current reasons, if they were not, in some cases, to be applying prefabrication modularization, they said then it was driven by the fact that the architects didn't include it in their design or the projects they were doing did not necessarily match up with what they thought prefabrication modularization could do. The two top drivers for future use of prefabrication modularization by firms that were already using it boiled down to improvements in project schedule and decrease in construction costs. They were way up there on the top. And in fact, some of the data you'll see when you get the deck, we had a range where we looked at different time on schedule as well as cost savings. Key takeaways that we found from the players: future implementation will be driven based on player perception. And this is important because as you're trying to sell and move this industry forward, you need to know who you're selling to and what you have to do about convincing them. So for instance, owners need to better understand productivity benefits. So from a marketing and business development standpoint, it becomes really important to convince owners of the productivity improvements that come out. Architects need to have the owner demanding it of them. So once again, by conveying that to the owner, the architects will include that more. Engineers and contractors need the architects to specify it. And so you see the whole cycle here. And then some specialty contractors need to continue to take the lead. And a number of specialty contractors do take the lead in this area. Mechanical engineers, fabricators, and design builders were noted as key in terms of driving this. So here, I mentioned we do the forecasting on the marketplace. So you can see in 2010, 154 billion was the size of the total construction market, and in 2015, 302 billion. What's interesting is when I superimpose the green marketplace for new construction over that, you can see how rapidly it moved from the 2% up to the 35% of market going to the 50%. And what's really nice, and Gail mentioned that as well in her study on LEED, is the influence that green has, and by working that in, some of the data that I will touch on here as I wrap up does get into waste on construction sites, green material selection. So there's a lot of exciting aspects to this industry tied to green. So here is a good summary slide, though. You can see productivity and business benefits, decreasing project schedule. So when you look at the left in terms of those that we surveyed, 66% of the users reported that project schedule is decreased. What amazed us in looking at the data was the number of weeks. Look at the 35% said 4 weeks or more in scheduling. That's a big impact on that bottom line. So that's the kind of a data, when you're talking to owners in that in terms of productivity improvements, that carries a lot of weight. And depending on the nature of the business, in terms of how important that schedule will be, in addition to the fact its impact on costs. Here you can see on project budget. So 65% of the users reported project budget decreased. And you can see that it decreased by at least 1 to 5% for 24% of those. But moving across the board, even at 5%, found that it decreased the costs by 20% or more. Those are significant numbers when it comes to project costs. So once again, a very strong indicator as to the influence it has on the industry and for owner decisions. Here we can see the lower purchase and installation price for materials. 47% found the purchase installation price decreased by, as you see, less than 1 to 5%, 17% found that. Moving over to less than by 10%, or more, 12%. Now, besides the purchase of the material in quantity, you have less reduction in terms of waste material by doing it off-site under controlled environment, and then the installation costs are reduced in terms of what can be done in that controlled environment. So a significant impact. These are the kinds of data that we're pulling out right now that really have a strong influence on justifying why going prefabrication modularization makes so much sense. Productivity, so site safety, here you can see 56% stayed the same, 34% saw an improvement. I mentioned before, one of the comments from owners was the scaffolding reduction as well as labor increases and being able to use labor that may not have been at the same level when there's a labor shortage, but knowledgeable because you can control the environment from a safety standpoint within the area where the units are being built. Here you can see the green benefits that contribute to cost savings. So 77% reported that site waste is reduced. So if you're doing LEED, green buildings, of course, very important. You see the reduction of site waste, less than 5%, 32%, decreased by over 15%, 13%. So that really speaks to the difference of waste reduction. You can also see the reduction of the material use itself on the chart on the right. 62% found that they were reducing the materials being used. And so once again, the numbers coming across, very strong components for green design and construction. This is probably the best way to bring it all together. So we all recognize that prefabrication modularization is improving productivity. And here you can see from the study. So if I go down the list, decrease in project schedule. So we found from the firms reporting 66% found a decrease in project schedule. 35% reporting decrease of 4 weeks or more. In reductions in project costs, 65% reporting decreases, 22% of over 10% in project cost. Lower materials purchase price, 47% reporting, 30% report decreases of 6% or more. Site safety, we didn't ask many questions on site safety, so there's no way to quantify that breakdown except for what they noted. Decreasing waste out of the 77% that reported the benefit, 44% reporting decrease of 5% or more, and then the decreased use of materials, 62%, reporting 27% decrease of 5% or more. And as I showed you on the other charts, you can see the split on how that distributes. So some fairly strong indications when trying to sell architects or owners on the real value seen toward improving productivity. So to wrap up, what have we learned from the data? Well, from all of the players that we surveyed, we found improvements in productivity and competitiveness in the marketplace were key business drivers. The decreasing of the construction costs and project schedule were right there at the top and the most important to bottom line benefits. And then, of course, the reducing site waste and materials was truly a recognized green benefit. As more and more, as I said earlier, as we moved to 2015 with 50% of new green construction to 50% of new construction to be green, this becomes a very major player in qualifying as green buildings. When we break out what we learned from contractors, we found that the contractors felt the architect needs to be speccing this more. Subcontractors really play a key role in driving prefab modularization adoption, and model-driven prefab is having an important and growing impact on contractor projects, so the role of BIM really key. On the architects' data, we saw that owner demand and availability of quality were key drivers, so the influence of quality in prefab is very important. Green benefits of prefab are particularly important to architects. And then on the engineer side, the owner is really the key driver. Market opportunities we identified when I was speaking about the different sectors. Healthcare is the strongest market, both in current and future activity. And the starts in that area is $53 billion over the next 2 years. So a real market opportunity for you. Hotels are seen as a growth area in terms of the modular rooms and units and bathrooms. And for engineers, warehouses, and manufacturing buildings appear to be the largest use area for application. So recommendations, education is really important. Educating all the players on the real productivity and business benefits at the bottom line for prefab modularization. Developing BIM objects for your products to make it easier for architects to specify in designs. So the more you can standardize the BIM object and get it into the architect's hands using BIM, the better. And then understanding and promoting the green benefits of prefab modularization, very important because of the growth in this area. With that, I will leave you and be happy to ask any questions. So I think from our standpoint, I mean, as a media company, we do a lot of market research on the industry. We track a lot of trends. And in fact, I put the websites up there because some of the stuff I referred to, a lot of the green research we do and research on different trends within the industry, some of it's available on our websites for that. But our objective is to educate the industry when there's a trend because we want to see the industry advance. And so taking a study like this, which was done by a lot of industry groups pulling together, and then producing it, making it available, the wider the distribution, the more that information goes out, the quicker the industry gets educated on the real value and benefits to the bottom line of prefabrication and modularization, which goes to the very point of making the case that you really want to be able to make. You're right on that leading edge right now, and I believe this kind of data, just as what we found in other sectors where we laid out trends, can really help to educate the industry and begin to bring about an understanding and belief that they have to be doing this.
You did a fantastic job of pulling it all together.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.